there were original works being created by some of the indigenous people, and it was for the very same reasons that the Greeks 2,000 years ago began creating these images. These were important medicinal plants. That plant, Buffoni, is highly toxic, and its papery scales are traditionally used, even to this day, in certain African medicines for healing wounds. So, one of the questions before we get on to the Dutch period is to ask this. How do you define botanical art? It's a very elastic topic. And there is one very eminent commentator, H. Walter Lack, he's a Viennese, and this is what he said. The purpose of every botanical illustration is to give an exact picture of a plant. To require the plant in a botanical illustration to be recognizable is a premise of Western thought traceable to the Greece of classical antiquity. And Dr. William Stern, also one of the great commentators from the British Museum, said this: differences of intent rather than artistic skill distinguish botanical portraits from flower pieces, in which flowers are depicted primarily for aesthetic effect as components of an artistic creation. The flower painter fails if his work lacks beauty. The botanical artist fails if his work lacks accuracy. So those are various ideas on what botanical art's all about. Simon van der Stel, in 1685, carried out orders from the Dutch East India Company to investigate the copper mines in Namaqualand, and he set off on a grand expedition. He had with him one of the company's officials, Hendrik Claudius, and Claudius was deputed to make a very accurate record as best he could, and he was a bit of a hack artist, to be honest, of what he saw on the way. This is a rather charming picture of their encampment at the Carolusberg near the present-day town of Springbok. You can see the Dutch flag flying over the tents, Allodichotoma, the kokerboom, at the side, and it's really a rather wonderful picture, actually, because it's probably the first illustration of a plant community anywhere in South Africa. And this is the way they would have travelled. This is Meerhofskasteel, which is a very curious eminence, very difficult to find. It lies west of the little dorp of Garies in southern Namaqualand. It's a mountain made out of white quartzite, and it has a permanent pool in front of it. Look at the wagons with VOC written on them, the Dutch travellers with their beautiful tricorn hats. Despite that, it was pretty primitive travelling in 1685. The paper they had was poor quality, the paints they had were poor quality, and yet they managed to produce some amazing images. The first set of these images has ended up in Trinity College, Dublin, and this is one of Claudius's paintings. It's been copied many times, so the South African Library in Cape Town has a set. The South African Museum, Ezekiel Museum, has a set of varying quality, because like the Greek Materia Medica herbals, they were copied again and again. But this is from the original so-called Codex Witzenius in Trinity College, Dublin. And these collections of plant portraits were bound into large volumes known as codices, and they were very often given or purchased by the senior directors of the Dutch East India Company. Very often they were given to some of the Dutch academics, like Paul Herman and Boerhaave in Leiden at the universities in Holland. The images, as I said, are rather crude, and in a funny way, they tend to reflect the rather crude understanding of botany and plant structure and organization which prevailed in those days, in the late 1600s. That's Cotyledon orbiculata. The colors, amazingly, have survived very well over time. I can't show you all of them, but the Codex Witzenius was originally apparently a 10-volume collection. So you can see Claudius produced a great many plates, probably anything up to 500, as far as we can tell. There was another set made, and I shall show you a little of that in a moment, which was called Icones Plantarum et Animalium, pictures of plants and animals, and it's here in Johannesburg in the Central Library, also made at that time. So this was the age of the explorer artist who ventured into the interior, and we must understand the difficult, rough, rugged conditions that they had to put up with. The next man who comes into the scene is Colonel Robert Jacob Gordon. He was the commander of the Dutch garrison at the Cape from about the 1770s right up until he died in 1795. He actually committed suicide. It was as a result of the first British occupation. He felt that he'd let the side down and that the Battle of Muizenberg might have been won by the Dutch had his forces perhaps persisted a little bit more vigorously. But Gordon was a man of enormous intellect. He had a Scottish father and a Dutch mother. He was not just a military man. He was fascinated by the geology of the country, the plant life of the country, the animals, the insects, and he even took some of the first accurate meteorological records. An extraordinary individual, and he was part of this great information gathering process. Gordon's originals were taken by his wife back to Europe, and they eventually ended up in the Rijks Museum in Amsterdam, where they still are. I'm told somebody is planning a big exhibition of the Gordon originals in South Africa next year. The images are an enormous improvement on Claudius, and again, Gordon emphasizes plants that are useful. That is Gethyllis afra, the famous Cucumakrunca, whose fruiting pod that you see there is so very popular. A rather nice colored plate of Acacia Karoo, the most common and widespread of all the acacias in South Africa. And you can see Gordon was following the European tradition of dissecting out the floral parts. The bulb split in half with the tunics removed, the open flower, the calyx, the stamens, the anthers. So Gordon was really a man who was beginning to raise the scientific tone of the work that was produced in South Africa. Some of these are undoubtedly Gordon's own work, but we do know that he took with him an artist who was known as Johannes Schumacher. Artists, sadly, in those days, seem to have been rather downplayed. He's often referred to as Mein Schilder or De Schilder, and it's only with a lot of archival digging that you find this poor man has a name, and he's actually called Johannes Schumacher. So some of them are by Gordon and some are by Schumacher, who was merely acting on the boss's orders. I mentioned the Icones Plantarum et Animalium. That's not a particularly good photograph of the volume sitting in the Central Library in Johannesburg, but it is a fantastic collection of marvelous pictures. That's the Warboom Protea arborea. That is Haleria lucida, one of our common kloof trees, all with extensive annotations. And here's a very good illustration of the flowering spike of a kokerboom, and it's annotated in Dutch, Blom van de kleine namakwaland aloe of kokerboom. Van de jonge stamen marked pale koekers marken. From the young stems, arrow quivers are made. I think there's something like 300 or 400 plates in that particular codex that you saw. So this Dutch period was really dominated by an amazing interest in the natural world at the Cape. And it's a very curious thing to me that despite the fact that we have vast portfolios of good botanical art coming out of the Cape at that period, surprisingly little fine art emanated from the Cape at that period. There are not many portraits, there are not many family pictures. There are a few landscapes, and very often the landscapes were imaginatively recreated in the Netherlands. So botanical art really got off to a very powerful start because of the Dutch influence at the Cape. Had Spaniards or Portuguese, and I hope nobody's Spanish or Portuguese here, colonized the Cape, I don't think botanical art would have got very far, quite honestly. A man who traveled with Colonel Gordon was another military gentleman, Colonel Patterson. He was the personal plant collector for the Countess of Strathmore in Scotland. And these are some of his pictures, which are in the Brenthurst Library in Johannesburg. That's Fenestraria aurantiaca. Sorry it's so small for those of you at the back. It's a little mesem, little facie from Namaqualand, which grows in the sand, and only the tips of its leaves are exposed. But the important thing is, he illustrated it with an open flower. These are two species of Argyroderma from the Knersvlakte between Niverus and Van Reinsdorp. Also mesems, shown with open flowers. Why do I emphasize that? They opened for a very brief period during the day. So Gordon had to work furiously to get these images in an open state. And again, one must marvel at the tenacity of these people, riding on horseback with a rotten old wagon coming on behind, how they persisted in getting images of this quality under those difficult conditions. And that's Conicosia pugioniformis, a very common mesem that occurs all over Namaqualand, opening in full glory during the hours around midday. So 1795 is an important watershed.